What a beautiful conversation. Nicola takes us on her journey, something that happened to her that she couldn't predict, that changed her world, went against everything that her science background actually had taught her. There's so much wisdom in this conversation. Stick with it. I promise you, there's so much into this that Nicola is able to explain to us. And it's how we can look at sustainability in a different way, how companies can actually change their mindset. But you have to follow that journey. It's such an amazing story to behold. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's dive in. Okay, so welcome back to Vantage Point Conversations. I'm your host, Colin Parsons, and as always, I get to have interesting guests on these conversations. Sometimes I know something about it, other times I know zero about it, and zero is one of those days. I know nothing about really the conversation. Nicola, I don't introduce my guests. It's not me being lazy. I just think that I would do a very bad job. So I just throw over to you for a few seconds, take as long as little time as you like, any background, highlights, lowlights, context, anything you want everyone to know about you, and then we just dive into the conversation from there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colin. It's really good to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So I will do a little introduction, not just to introduce myself, but to introduce where I am in relation to Indigenous knowledge. It's really important where I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm based in South Africa. I've been here for 4 generations. And if I go back in my ancestry, my Indigenous ancestors were back in Cornwall and in Scotland, so the Celtic fringe of Great Britain. But I've been there and I've kind of walked on the land, and I can tell you that my feeling sense for that Indigenous space is close to zero. And yet I've been here as a family, as I said, 4 generations or so, and I have found my way into Indigenous knowledge systems here. And as a non-Indigenous person, it's really important to say that that doesn't mean I can speak on behalf of Indigenous knowledge. I can't. But what I can say is that as a descendant of settlers here in South Africa, in a time where a lot of people are saying, isn't there something we can learn from Indigenous knowledge? Or I'm sure we can learn something about transition from Indigenous knowledge. Yes, I've been trying to do that, and to do that respectfully and in a way that's effective for the people I work with for a couple of decades. And so that's where I sit, in a place where a descendant of settlers is seeking respectfully to learn from a knowledge system in which I did not grow up, not deeply. And so that's where I am, Cape Town, South Africa, learning from the people and from the land here, and working in the field of sustainability, and specifically the field of sustainable transition. So an organization that seeks to move towards something more just and more sustainable in ecological terms.
Amazing. You give me so many places to kind of jump off there. But I mean, we, like all my guests, we have this initial conversation, which was, I think, just a week back. You kindly said that you would find this spot to speak today. And I had to cut you off quite quickly because wasn't because I was trying to be rude. It's just that you started to tell me a story, just a sort of earlier part of your career, and it gave me goosebumps. I was really like, oh, okay, there's something behind here. So I'm wondering if we can just go over that again, maybe just a sort of little bit of context, because I thought it was great, and it will probably maybe set the scene for the later part and the conversation. Is that possible?
Yeah, sure. So my training, my formal training in universities at the University of Cape Town and later in Yale University was, as I said, sustainability. And broadly speaking, it's systems thinking, it's looking at ecological systems. And in my case, my particular focus was in industrial ecology, or how we might apply this kind of thinking in corporations, mainly large-scale businesses operating in different parts of the world. And I was young and enthusiastic, and I just graduated. I started a job at Nissan South Africa, but very soon I realized that there was an opportunity in this space. People were just waking up to what sustainability was. There weren't a lot of people who were practitioners, and suddenly there was a lot of opportunity. So I decided way too early, to be quite honest, to become a consultant, probably before I should have. I had no idea. that consultants really need deep experience. But I thought enthusiasm made up for that, which it doesn't. But off I hopped on a plane to a place in Australia called Argyle Diamonds. Now, this is a very, very large mine. It's based in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia. It is very remote from Perth. It's about a 4-hour drive, so it's not near any major cities. Of course, there are local communities there. There are Aboriginal communities to that area. And in I flew and disembarked the plane, and I immediately felt a little strange. Now, I've never felt sort of strange in places. I'm quite a grounded, scientific type of person. I've never had imaginary friends or anything like that, so I'm not the sort of overly sensitive type. But in Australia, I began to feel uneasy, and I didn't know why. As I said, diamond mine, and they're extracting, it's probably the largest per carat diamond mine at the time. This was in 1999. And I was walking quite soon. You literally fly in and fly out to do consulting jobs. And walking across the mine, it was exquisitely beautiful. If you've ever been to the Kimberleys, I don't know if you haven't, right? But it's as if the earth is a kind of deep red ochre color. And the mountains that surround it, also like into a valley, are golden, really golden. And at this time of year, it was late November, the ground was dotted with purple heathers, the sort of, well, I call it like a heath, like a little sort of heather flower. And every now and again you could see what they call baobab trees, which is much like the African baobab, a very iconic tree. And I was walking along with one of the mine managers, and he was explaining that they were busy putting all of their standard operating procedures into a digital system. It was the beginning of SAP and the digital ages. And so this was a time when all that almost implicit knowledge that people held in their heads was being digitized and put into digital systems. And I was there to audit the mine. I was trained in environmental auditing as one of my focus areas, and I was literally there to see, what do they do about environment, and do they do what they say they do? And as he was talking to me, I suddenly heard another voice, and it was a sudden, clear voice that seemed to come from nowhere, or it came from the mountain, or it came from the land. And the voice said to me, "This land is sacred. Nothing can justify what's being done to the earth." Now, remember, I'm a scientist, right? So this is not possible. Because no one else was saying this. I looked around. There was no one there. The guy I was with didn't seem to notice. I was the only one who seemed to hear it. And it was in that moment, for me as a scientist, so impossible that I just wiped out the memory. I couldn't process it. My body, my mind couldn't process it. So I literally forgot the instant it happened. And it was only a year later, with a whole lot of work that followed what happened when I left the mine, that the memory was returned to me very, very starkly and very vividly. And I knew absolutely that it had happened and that it was true. And that was the start of a process of not really being able to be myself in consulting anymore.
That's yeah, even hearing that for the second time still gives me goosebumps. It's
Me too, a little bit.
I just because I've talked about intuition. I've actually spoken about paranormal activity on here as well. But where do you feel that came from? I know you said like the mountains, etc. But like now, looking back or having knowledge, where do you think that is? Is that from you, or from the land, or from somewhere else? Where would you attribute it to?
I mean, that's a really deep question, right? And there are lots of frames we could bring to it. And I think it's important that we come to a frame that works for us. And the frame that works for us becomes coherent in relation to all our other experience. And so I'll share a little bit where I've come to, because it's not obvious how to answer that question. And there's not only one right answer necessarily. But for me, that voice came from a relationship. It wasn't from one thing or another thing. It was from a relationship, not only with me in the place, but relationships that had been cultivated in that place over millennia by Aboriginal people, by relationships of people to place, and relationships that took place in relation to sacredness. And so that holds a potentiality in the land. There is something going on that stays in the land. And we can look at traditions and we can see that people have cosmologies that wind around these things and that are deep and powerful. But I don't have any access to those cosmologies in Australia. But for myself, then learning a little bit about Indigenous knowledge in South Africa, what I came to realize is that there is certain exposure that I have as a South African to South African relational systems, and certain exposures that I have in my life to what we call in this place ancestors and spirits of those of the land, spirits of people. And our exposures can kind of just make us a little bit more sensitive. Anybody can have this. We all have a degree of intuition. But I think exposure, for some reason, can increase that to certain degrees. And so I think it was just a chance connection between someone who'd had exposure in South Africa, a descendant of settlers, right, who doesn't understand the stuff, for whom the stuff is not normal, yeah, in quote unquote, suddenly jetting into another place where my familiarity bias, this idea that we can overlook what's not real, right, it kind of isn't working anymore because I'm not familiar. I'm now deeply out of place, in fact. And I suspect in that particular mix of things, something just happened. Something in the land managed to get through my filter, my cognitive filter, which would have said, this is not going to happen because it does not exist. So a signal appeared. Was it a voice? No. It was a signal. But my brain, some part of me, turned it into a voice. How it did it, I don't know. But it feels like that was happening. And something in my body, something in my mind, didn't delete it completely. In other words, there's an idea where we can have a kind of a prediction of what this thing is, and then the mind overrides it as being false, and then uploads what is really going on. No voice, right? Except perhaps my mind wasn't sure. There was something about this instance that made it keep it accessible as a memory. And a year or so later, it came back. I don't know if that's true. I don't do neuroscience or I don't have MRI scans, but it felt feasible to me as an explanation, and it certainly felt good enough for what I subsequently came to learn.
It's it's really strange. It's kind of aligned with a lot. I think we know so much. So even if we just take intuition, I think intuition is, because I've got 2 young children, you see that they understand so much more about themselves and about things that we can't really see, or we've filtered out that from our lives. And I think, it's very interesting, and I've talked about it before. But also this part, so you tried to say no and just blanked it out of your mind. So when it came back, what was wrestling? Was it in your body more than anything else? Was it in your mind? What sort of symptoms came back for you?
Well, of course I didn't know what had happened, but my body did not feel right either. So I was there for about 2 weeks as a fly-in, fly-out auditor. And I left never feeling comfortable. I had headaches while I was there. I was not feeling good at all. I was deeply relieved to get onto the plane and head back to South Africa. I was like, okay, can I just have a glass of wine now? Because I really need to try and relax. It didn't help at all. Got back to South Africa. It's a very long flight. And I got off and I thought, thank goodness. And I am not going back to Australia because, it's amazing and it's beautiful. But it kind of didn't feel good for me. And I would have wished it could have ended there, but it didn't. So what happened from that point onwards got worse and worse. I was shaking. I had panic attacks, increasingly serious panic attacks. My body broke out into rashes on my joints. I had big red circles on my chakra points. I didn't really know about chakras, but I kind of, realized, this is an interesting placement. And it carried on and carried on. And I mean, it was the panic attacks that was really serious, because as soon as I went into a situation of relative stress, for example, into a board meeting, right? Or, an attempt at doing some consulting work, it started to go kind of out of control. I was starting to see things that didn't seem real and hear things. And then after about a year or so, and I actually was in therapy at the stage, I went into just psychodynamic therapy with a very local therapist who was great and increasingly worried. And it really got to the point where after a while, I had this thing it's called synesthesia. It's when your mind can literally confuse a signal that is auditory with a signal that is, for example, visual. It's kind of hard to explain. And your experience at the time, or my experience at the time, is really just confusing. It's just that you don't know what's going on. But essentially, I was in a board meeting, and the person had been talking for about a minute or two, and I didn't realize he had been talking because I couldn't hear a thing. I just heard a blur. And what I'd noticed is that what he was saying seemed to be coming out of his mouth as lights, right? Literally balls of golden light. Now, I know this kind of classifies me as being, sort of mentally ill, and I was in terms of the psychotherapeutic discipline and profession. And yet, I thought there was something interesting in what was happening. At that point, I thought, well, I can't control this. And I needed to go to a therapist that I felt more comfortable with, because my body did not feel comfortable with psychotherapy. At that point, I went to see a Sangoma, which is an Ngoma practitioner in the local knowledge tradition. It is kind of like a diviner, but not only a diviner. But they divine with bones. So they throw bones. They throw a mixture of objects that represents reality. And then with you, they look at what those bones are talking about, these incredible patterns. They're very beautiful patterns. As this woman threw the bones for me, I looked at the pattern and I just remembered. And I said to her, Gogo, because we call them grandmother. This is Gogo. It's a sign of respect. I said to her, Gogo, I remember something. And she said, what do you remember? And I said, the mountain spoke to me. And then she just laughed and she said, oh yeah, that's a thing, And what did it say? And so that's when I just realized that for her it was possible. And perhaps that plus the bones just made me remember. I don't know again, Colin, what it was, but it just evoked a memory that hadn't been evoked in what was at that stage about 8 months of psychotherapy.
That's I think in that, were you scared? Like, because it sounds like, when reality seems not to match up with the outside world, that for me seems a very scary place. And I love the fact that you were interested in the light coming from this gentleman's mouth. I think that's, I want to say your saving grace. That sounds horrible, but I in a way that because that's quite a thing to happen to someone, and I think we often try to rationalize things. I know I have a logical mind, so we try and justify things with some sort of logic. And in that moment, I don't necessarily know that you can. Is that quite scary?
It's terrifying. It is really scary. There's nothing romantic about it. I can tell you it. I mean, it kind of makes a good story on one hand, but the good story it makes, and thank you for pointing it out and for naming it. No, it's really, really scary. And what is really scary is if you've grown up in a culture where this is not possible, or at least it's not legitimate. And it dawns on you over time that you have no control over it. There are ways we can try to control it. And what I was doing at the time was I realized, I'm a bit of a scientist, and so I experiment, right? What works and what helps it. And one of the things that helped was physical exercise. So I was training martial arts, and I was training, an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day. I was training up to 4 hours a day, just to keep the energy to the level at which the really weird stuff didn't happen. I was in therapy twice a week, and managing a diagnosis. My therapist, and I think she was a good therapist, and she was absolutely within her profession and correct for that. She said, you're highly depressed. And potentially, if you don't go on antidepressants now or antipsychotics, I'm not going to be able to treat you. That was terrifying, because by that stage I had a level of dependency. Yet every bone in my body was saying, and antipsychotics and antidepressants are not the way to go. I don't know why. I don't understand psychotherapy. I respect it as a discipline. Of course, I'm familiar with it to some extent as a Westerner, if you like. But I just knew this was not what I could do in a useful direction. And that was terrifying, because she said, well, then I can't treat you. And it was respectful, but she said I would be out of my professional boundaries. And then I had to make a choice. And I had to say, well, do I go with this lovely woman called Maclality Banger, or do I stay with a psychotherapist and, go with her conditions? And then I said, I have to trust my body here. And that's when I decided to say, all right, I'm going to leave psychotherapy. Worry her a lot. But I decided to go and train in the system. And now it's a training that is also a cure. And this is the way the local Indigenous knowledge system deals with this kind of sickness.
So I was just thinking the transition between those, they're like polar opposite, because things like energy, etc., often are surrounded by, depends obviously who you're talking to, but very, I want to say woo-woo, and we say woo-woo almost to protect ourselves and make ourselves sort of it be comfortable that we can talk about it. But I've had different people talking about different things here. So I've also been through therapy myself, and at the point in time, there's so many different modalities, right? And then so you haven't gone to something closer to psychotherapy. You've gone here. Now, that's not always easy to go that way. How did that search go? Did you try other things in between, or did your body, was it sending you that way? Did you know about this stuff? Because I've never ever heard of that before. Is that a South African thing that people would come across? Is that a common thing?
Ngoma as a culture, as a tradition. Yeah. Oh yeah. It's so Ngoma comes originally. It's about 4,000 years old, so it's not ancient system, but it's around 4 millennia. It's been around. It developed at a time when people were starting to scale agriculture, really, agriculture and pastoralism. So it is what I call a knowledge system that is part of a modernity, but not the modernity that emerged in Europe. What is the North Atlantic modernity, the one that has kind of taken over the world through colonialism and capitalism? That's a particular variant of modernity that just happens to be quite virulent in the way it scales and the way it extracts. But other modernities emerged. And for me, I define a modernity as a society in which there is a degree of extraction of surplus from the land, right? It could be, calories from the land or cattle, or, eventually it comes into the land itself and capital and labor. So you extract a certain surplus, you store that surplus. So you can think of a granary, right? Putting your grains of your crop into the granary, and manages that surplus and then distributes that surplus. And depending what you are now extracting, you are able to grow that surplus, and you can turn it into wealth because you can begin to trade it. And over time, what that leads to is issues of inheritance. So you have family structures become more important, because who's going to inherit the wealth that you generated, right? And you get power structures emerging in society. That's a very, very rapid, short description of modernity, but I call it a modernity because this is very distinct from the knowledge systems that emerged to support hunter-gatherer communities, which are typically highly egalitarian, and they don't extract. They are literally hunting and gathering in a way that is very light on the earth. Because as soon as we extract, as soon as we have a modernity, what we're doing starts to give rise to what we might call now unintended consequences. If you have a granary, you've got to start worrying about rats, and it completely changes your relationship to rodents, for example, or birds who are coming to eat your crops, or if you're going to be plowing with oxen, it changes your relationship over time. And to your neighbor who now is jealous because your granary is fuller than theirs. And maybe you probably stole from their crops anyway. And last week you just, plowed over their ancestor's grave. So you can start to see how this well-intended desire to have a little bit more certainty for next year gives rise to uncertainty at the same time. And ultimately to disruption, to conflict, and to huge amounts of difficulty. And you can just scale that up over the last, 10,000 years. And different modernities deal with this in different ways. So Ngoma had a way of dealing with the unintended consequences that arose from this now growing modernity. And over time, from Central and East Africa, these ways of dealing with life and reality and how to be more sustainable in terms of the natural world and more just in terms of people began slowly to migrate their way southwards. And so now you have very similar systems in Central and East Africa, but they're not necessarily called Ngoma, but they're similar. And the Ngoma systems ended up in parts of Southern Africa. So across, you'll find them in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Swaziland, and they're associated with what we call Nguni people, who are a particular language group, including Xhosa people, Zulu people, Ndebele people, and Swazi people. These are a large group of people who follow Ngoma practices. But the value of this knowledge system and its effectiveness in terms of healing and managing uncertainty in many respects saw it expand into other language groups and eventually to, the large parts of Southern Africa follow these systems. They're still around despite what happened during colonialism, which was obviously an attempt at erasure.
And so when you started this, were you skeptical? Because my brain keeps coming back that you have a science background. And often those things are, okay, everything has taught me a certain way, and now I have to kind of step into a world that maybe I'm not, it kind of goes in a different direction than I'm used to. How did you enter it in with skepticism, or was it just, I need help, I need to find something, let's explore, and you were open?
So it's more the latter, because by the time you've managed this sickness for a few years, you are literally desperate. You've tried other things. I did try something in between psychotherapy and Ngoma, and that was sort of energy healing. And it didn't work out well. The energy healer just looked at me with very wide eyes and said, I don't think I can help you. Because what happened was, as soon as you started bringing in the crystals and stuff, okay, and I do have some skepticism, I will definitely admit to that. At the time I did. Crystals and chakra healing, it was just a stretch too far for me. But it evoked in me an incredible rage, like a violent rage. Okay, and that's really, really made him worried, because it wasn't what he was used to, I guess, and he wasn't, and it was very clear because he was doing, when they test and they it's sort of neuro-linguistic programming or something, and your body agrees or it doesn't, and quite clearly my body did not agree with any of this stuff. So it was kind of clear from his diagnostics and from my evident growing rage that this wasn't the path for me. And for me, the Ngoma path just felt like such a relief, because it felt that every part of me was able to be there. Right? There was like, even when I was in psychotherapy, which is meant to be a sort of welcoming place in many respects, I started, editing what I was telling the psychotherapist, because I was tracking her degree of anxiety. Now that might be a projection. Of course, we know we do that when we go into therapy, but maybe it wasn't, and I don't know. But my experience was that safe place had to be managed in order to remain possible. And that felt really like a drain on my energy. So in Ngoma, I just knew, from the first woman that I met to subsequently the man who became my teacher in Botswana, I just knew I couldn't game them, because they were so much deeper than I was. They knew, it felt like they knew exactly what was going on. Not in the detail, but in terms of the gist of what the sickness entailed and how it might rightfully be worked with. That was such an incredible relief. I never really turned back.
And from that first session, was it immediate? So you talked about your sort of, things showing up on your body, etc. After that first session, was that a release in terms of you felt something, or you could physically see a change in the symptoms that you?
The symptoms got worse. It was like, I know, it's weird, right? It was like a floodgate had said, like, it's all right. I can be sick. It was like I had been given permission to be as sick as I needed to be, because she wasn't afraid. She was clear. She was strict, and she said, look, you don't mess with the sickness. We know the sickness very well. The sickness is a complex sickness. It expresses in different ways in different individuals. So for me, it was cognitive, it was mental. For another person, they could be lame, and then their arm could go lame, and these weird physical symptoms would beset them. For other people, the sickness can take expression in, sudden strange phobias and fears, or literally like the geyser breaking down all the time for no apparent reason. And that gets definitely quite woo-woo, but it's just known to happen. These are patterns that are recognized over time. And actually getting angry is also a characteristic of the sickness. There's a particular kind of ancestor. So Ngoma is an ancestral tradition. It's not just animist, it's ancestral, because there's an inheritance aspect to it. And we have something in obviously the expansion of colonialism, the expansion of global capitalism and extractivism, that gives rise to war. That gives rise to extraordinary brutality. That gives rise to genocide. Clearly, this hasn't gone away, right, after thousands of years. So we're still seeing this. And at the same time, we can, as modern people, people who are kind of scientists, sort of think, okay, well, the war's finished now. We're kind of over that. Let's look ahead and let's, become sort of more like the rainbow nation. This is very much part of where South Africa started about 30 years ago as our democracy came into being. And yet it seems, if you go back to these traditions, when we have wars, when we have brutal killings, when we have deep exclusion, what we have is entanglements that don't go away, even if we don't believe it. And so for me, I think to recognize, and one of those things is that the emergence of what's called war ancestors, which I've looked at quite a lot, but this idea that we are entangled with the brutality and the violence that emerges in place in support of extraction. And we've got to work with it. We've got to make it conscious. And that's why the woo-woo stuff, which, on some level, it sounds quite nice, but it's to a large extent fairly romanticized often as being something lovely and comfortable and, something that's really affirming from the universe. I would have probably been a little skeptical of that, because my experience of this particular reality, of how it came to express in my body and obviously in my mind, was this was not comfortable. This was no affirmation, and this was anything but lightness and love. And so, yeah, I think that's really where these traditions are potentially so valuable, because they don't sugarcoat the reality of human experience, and certainly not the reality of war and genocide.
And it's so I'm going to sort of say my simplistic reflection of that is that just basically something tells me this comes from the land itself. Like the land remembers all. That's what's coming out in my brain, and that it holds these stories, holds this knowledge of what's happened over time. Am I making that too simple, or am I off key with any of that?
I think it's useful to be simple, and then it's useful to ask the question you ask afterwards, because yes, I think to an extent that does happen. And if you look at traditions, and certainly these are traditions in Australia, where I picked up this, we can say, problem or affliction perhaps. You have situations where you can walk across the land and hear and listen to the land. It's called songlines, I think, in those cultures. In Southern Africa, we do have this understanding. There are places we go that are deeply spiritual, and you will walk into those places and feel it. Maybe not everyone, but actually most people. You don't have to be, heavy intuitive to go into these places and feel something. The human body is capable of sensing things that we don't believe. It really is capable of doing this. If we suspend our judgment and our disbelief at the possibility of this, we are also able to work with that and allow it to amplify. And then sometimes some people will begin to hear things, some people will begin to see things, some people will begin to remember things. And so I think this thing is in the relationship between what land can hold through its relationship with people. Because I don't think this is the mountain making itself, making a statement. Mountains don't speak English, but the mountain in relation to the local Aboriginal people in that area, the Kununurra people, that area was able to take on an expression that was perceivable by some, obviously perceivable to the local Aboriginals, not so perceivable to the mind. But it did turn out that 10 years later, I did some more research. It took me a long time because I was a little bit in awe and a little bit, as I said, like a little bit scared of it, right? But I did go back to it and I discovered that Rio Tinto, the big mining giant, had bought Argyle diamonds about a year after I had left. And within a few years, they began running welcome ceremonies, which is a local Aboriginal sort of welcome to the land, as a way of being able to work with people who visited the mine, to cleanse them, to honor their relationship and allow them entrance into it. I mean, these are always quite fraught, they're politically difficult, because not everyone agrees with them in either Aboriginal or mining communities. But I felt like, oh, well, why didn't they do that for me? It was because it turned out that, in fact, they were mining a very, very sacred site. It was the Barramundi Gap, which is a sacred site to women. And the diamonds that were being mined by Argyle, which are notorious for their incredible rainbow colors that you'll see just above your right shoulder, right left shoulder for you. They are rainbow diamonds, essentially. They're exquisitely brightly colored. And the Aboriginal story, the old stories of the Indigenous people of that area, will tell you that those are the scales of the sacred barramundi fish, which by 2012, more or less, were fast being all extracted for the mining industry. It took them another 10 years to essentially clear out that entire area of all the marketable stones. So yeah, I mean, I gave you a long answer, but it is an impossible. There's no formula, right? But I think it sits in relationships and in deep, deep human history and knowing.
Yeah. So let's go back to that, because I'm fascinated by the part where your symptoms actually got worse. And I'll just reflect back to what my brain's saying. It's that feels like your body was given permission to process all of this, and so maybe your body had been resisting, and it was coming, but then you felt permission and trust with this lady, and then it came through, which it must be very relieving. But I can imagine, I don't, because my head goes, well, you go to see people to try and resolve symptoms, and then when they get worse, that seems very counterintuitive. So again, my logical brain keeps stepping in, and I'm going, well, hang on, that must feel like this huge relief, because you feel it's right, yet your body's showing up all these things. So where did you land with that? Like, do you just sit with it and you were comfortable with it? How long did it take? Did the symptoms go away? What's the next part of that story?
Yeah. So yes, they did get worse, and yet I felt less worried than before. Not because I had a way to control them. I was still working on that, and I knew, for example, at full moon, genuinely, at full moon, I could not schedule any work engagements. But for the 2 weeks in between the full moons, that's when I could do a little bit of work. I was still running every day. I was training karate all the time. It was really helping. So I had little management capability there, but not full control. And yet I suddenly began to meet people for whom this stuff was okay. That I knew had either experienced something similar. And so patterns are never going to be exactly the same. No one experiences exactly the same illness twice, but they recognize the patterns in how the illness expresses. It's notoriously resistant to antidepressants, by the way. It'll work for a while, but not for long, including antipsychotics. That's what Ngoma practitioners say. But I started meeting more and more people. And of course, now I'm a scientist and I'm looking for patterns in their experience alongside my own. So even though mine seemed to be getting worse, I had a little bit of management control. And I had at the same time a growing network of people who I felt, look, I probably thought they were a bit wacky, but I wasn't interested in them per se. I was interested in hearing about their experience. And in hearing their experience as to what actually happened in their lives and how they worked with it, I was beginning to create my own little understanding of what patterns were becoming possible. And then to know that there was a tradition wherein literally the cure for this was possible was a great relief. But it still took me about 6 months to agree to go on that cure, because it's a very intense 4-month ritual that no one would willingly want to do unless you were extremely desperate.
And you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but that's a 4-month retreat. If you want to talk about it, you can. But after that, all symptoms have gone. And you come out the other side, and I don't know if the word healed is correct. It's more, it feels like you understand more than anything.
Second, I'm just going to... So I'm happy to talk a little bit about that process. I can obviously talk about the parts that are we're allowed to talk about. Some little parts are secret, not because it's sort of heavy knowledge, but because it's knowledge that is ritually available through a particular process. And so there are some secret aspects to it because they need to come with a level of surprise. Okay, so that's how rituals work as well. But essentially, that 4-month training stroke cure, it's considered a cure, is a sickness for what they call ukutwasa. Ukutwasa is the Zulu name for this particular sickness, and it is named for the moon. Ukutwasa is the moon coming to fullness, and it is so. Coming to fullness as in the moon. So it is seen as a healthy thing. To some extent, yes, it is about healing. Although I asked my teacher, whose name was Bokweja, which means jackal, I asked him, does this mean I'm healed now at the end of that process? And he said, well, the word is actually more associated with being, it's an old kind of English word, unfettered. You are no longer fettered by what was holding you back. So now things can flow. And in that process, as I said, 4 months and very intense, what happens is this recognition that we are not individualistic. We have obviously a degree of individual identity, but particularly when we grow up in a modernity that is full of disruption, that is full of, frankly, violence, exclusion, that is extractive by nature. We are growing up in a context in which the spirits, those things that are in an animist world everywhere, are often displaced from where they need to be. This is what disruption does. And as it takes effect over time, more and more spirits are seen to be displaced from what is their rightful place. And so they begin to roam around. So you feel them in places. You'll know when you're walking on a battlefield and there have been a lot of people killed and very often not properly laid to rest. The funeral rites are not followed. And in those contexts, what we say is, the spirits are still roaming there. Or, as is the case in this local Ngoma tradition, there was one big battle where it was known as the Great Crushing for the Mumford clan. And in this battle, a lot of people were killed, so many that they just threw their bodies in the river. Right. So now what happens is the spirits become displaced because the funeral rites have not been met. And the spirits of those people begin to afflict. Afflict means they kind of connect in with an identity of someone for whom there is a resonance for that spirit. I don't have a better way of putting it. I mean, this is not a traditional way, but you suddenly start feeling a bit yourself and not entirely yourself. And in this case, violence can be very often. So if you were, for example, in a country like South Africa, where apartheid was so brutal, involved such a lot of death, before apartheid was declared, the local First Nations people, the San and the Khoi, they were literally the subject of genocide for about 100, 200 years. So there's extraordinary brutality still in this land, right? And what Ngoma people say, what animist or ancestral cultures say, is here we get afflictions. Afflictions is not only from your grandmother or your grandfather wanting you to be a healer, which is the classic shamanic affliction, but in situations where there is deep disruption, there is essentially rupture of the conditions that make life possible. Affliction begins on other people, anyone, which is why you end up with a person who is clearly not indigenous, but a descendant of settlers, potentially having this kind of sickness. And the training is as simple as this. What it does is it says, okay, you're an individual identity, but you also have affliction. You've picked up other identities that no longer have a place. In order to bring restoration to the land and to bring reconciliation to the land, and this is a political concept, right? To bring reconciliation, we are going to do the ritual that gives those particular spirits who are now afflicting a place in your own identity. Now, as your average Westerner, this is not going to go down well. This sounds a bit really weird and a bit dangerous. However, at this point, you're kind of brought into a system that feels increasingly coherent because you're doing the practices. It's making sense. You're seeing things, you're feeling things. The spirits are pitching up in a way that you thought would have been impossible, just a few months or years earlier. And so you realize, wow, this is extraordinary, absolutely inexplicable from a scientific Western point of view, but yet psychologically, spiritually, somatically, deeply right. And so you just go with that because, you've signed up for something for which there is only one way through, no way out. Yeah, so very lucky to grow up in a place where these traditions are still surviving.
And so after this 4 months, what then emerged for you? So I feel this, you've mentioned it as a scientist, this is everything against, I guess, that world, right? And you kind of wrestle with that, but you go with it because it feels right. Everything is showing you that it's the right path. After that, I would imagine you're changed forever. There's no going back. There's no, oh yeah, I did that and I'm just going to go back to being a scientist. Like that's just not a thing. What happens then?
Yeah. Great questions because you're staying with it, which is so good, Colin. So yes, you are changed forever. And when you're in it, all you want is to be healed as an individual, right? And these trainings are not conceptual. So you don't sit down, you don't have a desk, they don't read you things, you don't get access to notebooks. It's all oral tradition. The training takes place in a homestead with acacia trees and thorns, and it's beautiful in some respects, but it's very traditional. It's mud, it's thatch, it's all those kinds of things. And so what happens in this situation is you go through this ritual experience that is physically extraordinarily demanding. And at the same time, what they're doing is not just healing you, but they're teaching you a skill. And the skill they teach you is the skill of the diviner, the skill of the ritual specialist. They're teaching you to understand how to do rituals in this context, and in this particular lineage called Fontor that I was training in the context of disruption, in the context of war, in the context of extraction. And so this training as a diviner involves you needing to essentially train your intuition to another level. And how they do this training is they hide things from you. And you're expected to tell them what is hidden and where it is. And there are ways to train your ability to do that. And on some level, it can be very woo. It sounds woo, except it's not very woo, because right now it's like 38 degrees in the Kalahari sun. You're kneeling because you spend most of this time on your knees. It's very deeply immersed in humility. You're in the public view, and your teacher is hiding things from you that you are now expected to find. And the little kids are gathering around and laughing at your deep discomfort. And you have to tell them where they are. And they teach you a little method as to how to train your intuition. This process is called umfihlo. Umfihlo is a Zulu word again, and it means the science of hidden things. It means if you're going to be a diviner and go back with a useful skill to your community, because it's not just individual, right? Then you better use this ability to pick up spirits, to pick up, weak signals of things. Put it to work, and let's see you do it. Let's see you put your ancestral spirits to work, because we're giving them a place now in your identity. Put them to work, make them useful. And to show that you can do that, this is essentially the training. And at some point, after the weeks and the months go by, amazingly, anyone can train their intuition. But this happens very intensely in what we might call in Western terms a rather psychologically unsafe space, which is why we learn hell of a fast, to be honest. Because on some level, it's a bit of survival. And so you walk out of that training not only healed as an individual, but carrying a skill, carrying a capability that can now be returned to the community from which the sickness arose. And here you see the systemic patterns, right? Because it wasn't ever simply my sickness. My sickness comes from a particular modernity that is extractive, that, yes, was expressed perhaps through Argyle diamonds, but actually is expressed in every corporation that follows a law that says it's okay to accumulate surplus at the expense of nature and other communities. This, extractive capitalist that we live. And so the expectation is, and you only realize this towards the end because it becomes obvious, right? You just suddenly know things that you didn't know before, but very clearly this was not about my healing personally, but about how I am going to return this capability or knowledge to my community, which was not Argyle Diamonds, by the way, but which is corporate South Africa, because that's who I was working for. And at that point, I walk out with a paradox, which is, hang on, I've been trained as a diviner. Intuitively, I know it's relevant to extractive late industrial capitalism, but I also know I'm not able to go and divine and throw the bones like Gogo on the boardroom table, right? So that's my problem. And I sit with that, frankly, for 2 decades before I eventually found a way how to do it, which was a need that I had to really pay back, to return what felt like a deep obligation to the Ngoma lineage.
Well, in that 2 decades, were you searching for answers? Were you looking for different ways, or do you just have to sit in quiet? How does that work?
A little bit sometimes, on and off, but I didn't do it, actively all the time. It was always in the back of my mind. But once you do this tradition, you are in a lineage. So I'm now dancing. Dance is a very critical part of Ngoma training. So I'm dancing, initially every few weeks, every few months. As you get used to the system, you don't do these practices quite as much. But there's a lot of ceremonies to attend to be part of this community and to be part of this particular lineage. That is Fonto, that I am part of. So I have got almost a parallel life, or 2 parallel lives, right, going on here, which is, the one is, I did feel a desire to go back to consulting. So I'm having this parallel life where I'm doing consulting, still for corporate South Africa. I got increasingly at that stage into strategy, and how to do strategy intelligently, how to look at innovation, and particularly, again, strategy and innovation in service of life. So in service of, better environmental practices, better social practices. But I couldn't find a way to bring what I had learned through the Ngoma tradition nicely into that system. It felt too twee, like you could go and throw the bones, but really people would love it. And then on Monday morning, the bone, like, can we really take this seriously? So it would be what we would call now performative, edutainment for, I guess, a few interested execs on some leadership retreat. Not real, right? And that just didn't feel integrous to me. And so I kept those two things quite separate. And then subsequently, and I did write this down in a book actually, which is subsequently to tell the story of how over the next 2 decades, what I was experiencing and the unfolding insights that came through learning from other people, learning more in the lineage. I was in mentorship for those 20 years. I still am, actually. It's quite common in these systems. You continue to learn all the time. You take on students, you teach them as well. So the system is self-perpetuating. But eventually, it took a long time. And in fact, what helped me more than anything was during COVID, I was obviously at home, and I had a little bit of sort of access to kind of click into screens that I hadn't sort of used before. And I started to click into a few seminars. And that's where I met, so obviously online, or attended a seminar of what was to become the Cynefin Company, which is founded by a Welsh professor called Dave Snowden. And so his system was basically a particular approach to complexity science, which was focused on what he called anthro-complexity, the complexity that arises from people specifically, and people with their own particular understandings of identity, with their own particular kinds of intelligence, and with their own particular intentions, right? Their ability to kind of go into, for example, an extractive process and throw away the stories that question whether it's possible or suitable. And this anthro-complexity almost became a way for me to find you could say, like the connective tissue, a way to be doing sustainability and at the same time honoring my traditional obligation. I doubt I would have been able to find it without that, to be quite honest. But I found that in 2020, and then a few years later, that was it. I felt I could do it. And it's a very embodied thing, as you can imagine. It's not like, oh, here it is, here's the course, I can put it out. No, it's just a way of working that no one would necessarily notice unless I spent time afterwards to tell them why. Why in this particular workshop, we are honoring local Ngoma traditions without necessarily having to name them. But when you speak to people, they will simply tell you, I don't know why, but I feel that that was a really beautiful and very deeply human process, which for me was not common necessarily in your average sustainability strategy workshop. So that's what helped me to know. That was largely due to the ability to work them together with the Cynefin approach to complexity.
And so do you explain to people why they feel that way, or potentially why they feel that way, and they make the connection?
Well, often I work with a lead, so the person who's leading that transition for the organization. And depending on who they are, I mean, generally the people I work with are open to and interested in local Indigenous traditions. So they would know often. Or I would explain afterwards why and how this works, and why this is pattern recognition, and how pattern recognition works in Ngoma, or why this particular supply chain team is the only team with sufficient intuition to give grounded embodied intelligence in this space. And they might not call it intuition, but we will invite it in anyway. We won't necessarily name it. But we will set up the workshop where they're deep intuitive knowing, because they're the supply chain team working on the ground. They're encountering problems all the time. They're learning and they're human. They can feed it in. So I generally don't tell people unless they ask. If they do ask, then I could tell them. But in South Africa, it's still hard, to be quite honest. There is still, there's apartheid is gone in theory, but apartheid isn't gone in people's minds, because and it's not that people are overtly racist. It's just that there's an assumption that there's a way to do business practice that does not include the Ngoma traditions. So it's hard for them. But I did end up writing a book about it, which I'm trying to use to, if people want to know the backstory, then I send them to the book. And so it's getting easier for me to bridge that now.
Yeah, I was thinking when I know it's not a new concept to the people that know, right? But it's bringing in something that's been known for a long time to people that don't understand it, and I've seen that in so many things. That's a lot of the hard work is almost that part. It's just trying to connect that, and I think you've done it in a very clever way. Because oftentimes we beat the drum and sort of say, look at this, but it's actually try this. Look, we're going to do this, and then you can sort of say, look, if you want to go and look at the drum, we can go and look at it. And that I think that's a very smart way of integrating these things in a culture or in a society that's not always, ready for those sort of things. So I think that's brilliant. What what sort of changes are you seeing with these? So I assume it's companies that you're working with to help. What sort of changes are you seeing? Because I've been fascinated with business for a long time. I don't know what it is, but it's just something that I'm very fascinated by. Oftentimes, I realize what we would assume was logic. Everything is run by logic and data, etc. And people say, look at the data, look at the analytics, etc. And you go, yes, but often there's a bigger thing that we don't look at, and we go, well, no, we're not doing that because it doesn't make sense from a data perspective. I'll give the simplest example I ever can. So, people believe that, working in a big corporation, that you're safe and that you'll be employed forever. And you might be the absolute superstar of that company and you do brilliant work, profits, whatever. One day someone's going to look at a spreadsheet, doesn't know anything about you, and it might be that you're not the superstar, but you are the glue that holds so much together and you don't exist. But no one can explain to that person who's looking at a spreadsheet what you do and how you do it. And it's just, and that's the thing, you don't see that on job descriptions. We need this type of person that just can connect all of these things, because it's often very intangible. It's not something you can go, yes, it's that. Or you might see it and you go, oh, quick, have a look at that. That's what I'm talking about. And it's just this whole world. And so I, I'm, I believe that some of the best businesses, and, best businesses, isn't just about profit. That's how we tend to see it. It's about growing and everything like that. Whenever I've heard stories or spoken to people, it's so much more than data. The data it's not neglected, but it's not the thing that runs the company. It's all these intangible things, and it's more than culture. It's more than those things that you can't put an explanation on. And so how does that show up for these companies that you work for? Is it that and again, in a company, we're not all, unless you work for a company that has a similar mindset and culture that are quite open-minded, can be quite rare, but I would imagine in smaller companies that have grown and been very, not strategic, but very mindful of the type of people how they work and the people that they invite into that ecosystem. So in most companies, you have such a mix of personalities, understanding, openness, etc., etc. How does your work go in and help? Is it you help one person and then it spreads, or you help one person and then they leave? What are you seeing with all of that?
Yeah, you're so right to name the value of working quietly, without beating drums too hard, because that, in a sense, takes attention off from the work you're actually doing onto this idea of, oh, and it's Indigenous. And that almost invariably includes a layer of potential appropriation of culture. where it is extracted from its context and used almost to brand or market something, which is invariably not in the interest of the culture itself. It's in the interest of the person who's seeking branding. And this is often, well-intentioned, but often I think overlooks what it's doing to undermine aspects of the culture. So I had to be very careful of that. Not being Indigenous myself, this becomes extremely important. So the way I work in an organization is usually with a deep long-term partnership with somebody who has the responsibility of guiding, you could say, I suppose, leading an aspect of just and sustainable transition. So not just environment, but environment and social, so how those things blend, because I find it almost impossible to separate out the land and environment and people and justice. Those things are very intertwined and entangled for me. And they typically have a deep experience of the company themselves. And I come in as a partner, and I think I call it a think-do partnership. So I'm coming in to be their partner on equal terms in many respects, but with a different set of skills, with a shallow understanding of their organization necessarily, but a broad understanding of many other organizations that have also looked towards some kind of sustainable transition. And so together, we've got two minds beginning to look at patterns, and we simply meet every week, right? And in giving effect to this sustainable transition, we will need to work with teams within the organization. And it's how we do that work, how we do it. So very often you say, okay, well, we need a sustainability strategy. And if you go the old mainstream way that you're going to find with every second management, or probably most management consultancies, you're going to come there with a particular approach, which assumes we can predict the future, which assumes we can say, this is what perfect looks like. This is what utopia is, right? And we can describe it in terms. It's often called your vision. And then we will kind of jump back to where we are now and have an understanding of where the gaps are, right? And then you set a bunch of milestones in between where you are now and that utopian vision. And those become your targets, right? And your KPIs and, your milestones. And then you have a strategy. And yes, you've done your delivery as a consultant and you can go off and do it again for another company. Now, this is very ironic if you're trained as a diviner, because people assume that diviners predict the future. Actually, they don't really predict the future. What diviners are doing in Ngoma tradition is they're deeply understanding the present, the patterns, and the past, the ancestral traditions that are beyond just humans. Ancestral is a concept that goes beyond just grandmother, grandfather. It's a far more entangled and engaged with land and ancestors that are not human. And so we have this deep understanding of patterns of the past and a deep understanding of the present. And when we get to that, we can begin to recognize patterns that are somewhat consistent over time. And those give us a little bit of a handle to know what to expect around the corner. This is how you do a level of, it's not quite prediction, but it increases your ability to make intelligent choices in uncertainty. So this is what we're doing when we are divining. Now, we can do it in the very traditional way, and most people won't know what to do because it's a very traditional ritual that gives rise to a divination. But we can pull it apart a little bit and recognize that we're doing a deep understanding of the present. We can recognize that we're looking at pattern recognition. We can see that we are activating embodied intuition, of those who are present in the room. And we can find different ways to do that. And suddenly you get into a point where you're no longer assuming you can predict some utopian future, like, say, net zero carbon. And, this is a good way to have a good direction. But as soon as you set net zero carbon goals, your teams who are under pressure to increase margin and profit are already trying to work out how to game them, how to kind of tick the box on net zero carbon and yet still do the old way of, basic extractivism, which allows them to deliver profit. Those teams are in a terrible situation because they're being incentivized to do one thing and then encouraged to bring their hearts and minds to work to deliver something else. They are not going to be happy campers. And you can delude yourself as the leaders to say, oh, well, that's all right, they'll get over it. And quote unquote, man up, if you can excuse the gendered comment. But essentially what you're doing is you are deeply disrupting the humanity of your team by setting them up to deliver something that is a workaround, that is actually not real. You're setting them up to effectively lie. And this is not good if you want to encourage, no matter how sort of hearts and minds you get about it. This is not good for your culture. And so what this way of working does is no, 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 no. Of course we know net zero carbon is a great idea, but to extract carbon as one singular goal in amidst the movement towards a more just and sustainable tradition can sometimes be problematic. How can we move towards what we know to be more right in a way that is far more intelligent, far more adaptive, far more able to self-correct as we go along, right? Far more willing to learn from other modes of knowing as we go along, to the extent that we can. Far more pragmatic, actually, than pressurizing your team to deliver on impossible trade-offs. And how can we effectively rehumanize this process of strategy delivery? I think it's very important when we've got AI, and I think AI has got its huge value, but we cannot assume teams are able to deliver in the way AI does, because it is so not sufficiently human. And so I think a lot of bringing together these Indigenous intelligence, if you like, and we could call it wisdom, but this Indigenous way of knowing that transition cannot be planned to some nth degree into some utopian future is a far more human way of honoring the intelligence of your team as well at the same time. And then for me, delivering a better strategy. Maybe not one that, hits the goals out on net zero carbon, but one that over time definitely delivers a more resilient and more human space to work. So that feels useful.
It's it. I always think about companies. They whatever looks good on the website is the thing that they aim for. And again, we get very fixated on things. Me included. We think about money. We think about things that but the reality is how we live better. And when I say live better, that isn't about the consumption of things. It's the way that we work, the way that we see things, the way that things flow. And yet we live in a world of consumerism.
Yep.
You know what I mean.
Yeah, consumerism.
And so we again, when you said about net carbon zero, is it the right way I've said it? That's because someone's aimed for that. Everyone seems to aim for the same goal as a comparison, and we're not comparable. And again, it's all the perception from the outside world of what that company looks like. But for the longest time, I've understood about the people inside that company and how they work and what's important. And we don't spend any time there. We spend time on the perception to the outside world, and that often probably drives revenue or whatever. But that for me is a very short-term game. Even if a company's in doing really well, it won't be that way for long. It's the internal parts, the moving, and that comes from people and so much more. And again, just to come back to that point, these are intangible things, and I've said for the longest time that people in a company are so smart, so clever. They do have intuition. They have all of these things, and they're almost like a can of soda, just sort of shaken up, ready to go. Yeah, I want to do it, and they're not allowed to do it. And I think I would love to see more businesses embrace that, and from a way that doesn't seem logical, because it's not logical. It's based on so much more. We said intuition, instinct. There's things I'm obviously not even touching on there, that you go, yeah, this on paper, this doesn't stack up, but it does. It really does. And I would love companies to change the way that they embrace and listen to their people, because I feel like you've said that, like the land, Indigenous people, these ceremonies, everything holds so much wisdom, but we're looking the other way. We're looking for, okay, yeah, this is the thing, but it's there, and you just need to pay attention to it. It takes time, takes patience. It's not an overnight thing, but it's there, and it helps for the future for a much longer period of time. That's my opinion anyway.
I think you're right, really, really right, and it feels like you're coming from a slightly different perspective to me, and yet we can align on that so fully, Colin. And it's around an understanding of strategy that in no way underestimates the importance of solving the challenge we have of climate change. I mean, if we don't solve that, genuine, we are tickets, and yet it's about saying how we do it matters, because if we're approaching climate change with solutions that come from the same mindset, that scaled extractivism. It's essentially, if we're approaching it with disruptive innovation and technology, what we're doing is we're assuming that disruption can continue to make things possible into the future. Well, not if traditional people or indigenous people are right about the impact of disruption on spirits and the degree to which those spirits then afflict and undermine the mental and physical health of people. This is a different worldview, but for me, it is absolutely consistent with what we see in the world. A rise of mental illness, a rise of also physical, lack of wholesomeness, one might put it that, people that are not strong anymore. And also a way of doing strategy that wrongfully assumes we can predict the future in a very complex world. Well, we can't. And if we need to lean into Indigenous knowledge to have a way of realizing that, it's very useful. And we are very lucky that it's available still.
Yeah. I think that's an amazing place to end. The time has just flown by. But I think I wouldn't want to add any more to that, because I think that's you've explained so much in such a beautiful way, and I know you've got a book out now that sort of explains this, and I'm sure there's a lot more in that. But I've really taken so much away from this, and you are able to explain it in such a beautiful way, and the way that you're doing that work and the way that you see these things, and obviously you had to go on a hell of a journey, that you you didn't sign up for, but it landed on your doorstep. I think that's amazing, and I think I hope a lot of people get that from this conversation and reach out to you because of this, or read your book and understand that, because I think just as you said, the way that we've been doing things in the past, if we keep looking to those people that seem to be solving those problems, it's not, they're not all saviors, and the way that we're doing things isn't, or, the way that it's going to solve all the problems. Thank you very much. Honestly, it was a real pleasure, mind opener for me, and that's always a great conversation. I found you. No, you found me, I think, on LinkedIn somehow, which says that I'm doing something good, which is great. But where should people find you? So normally there's a website or LinkedIn, or somewhere else. Where's the best place for people to find out?
Sure. Well, I am on LinkedIn, so you can follow me on LinkedIn, and you will find me under my name. I have a Substack, so if you like, I can give that to you, and you can put it in the notes. But you'll find it. The Substack is the same name as my book, which is Diviner Mind. Diviner Mind, I can show you if you like, and you will get the spelling. Because if it goes into anywhere, the autocorrect will take off the R, and it will be Divine Mind, and then you won't get this thing. You'll get something different. So the book is Diviner Mind, and the website is divinermind.com. And the subtitle is How Organizations Can Learn from the Indigenous Science of Uncertainty. And it's to a large extent an autoethnography. It's telling some of the story I've told, but in a lot more detail. And it gets a lot grittier, but then it's really trying to say, and so what? What pragmatically does this mean for us as people who want to make better decisions in respect of climate change and every other intractable problem we currently face? So yeah, I'd love to connect. Get hold of me through the website or through LinkedIn.
I'm thinking that book should hold a place in all of those sustainability departments in all of these companies, because I know that's most of the companies have that now, and I think that's a great North Star, right? Just to start to understand that, it would be a good place if people are unsure, you know, maybe they're just sort of stepping or putting their toe in the water in terms of I can't speak today, sustainability. Yeah, what a great, you know, thing to read and understand, and you know, maybe that will send them on a different trajectory than, you know, all the other companies. So yeah, what a great thing.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you for your questions and your beautiful listening. And it's been wonderful. Thanks, Colin.
That's right. It was my pleasure. Thanks, Nicola. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Hey, it's me again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and this conversation. Like most people, I really want subscribers. There's no shame in actually admitting that. But the only way that happens is if you click on the button and you subscribe to this channel. And if you click on the bell notifications, then you'll get more notifications. These conversations are 3 times a week. And so you'll see all these interesting conversations with a wide range of guests. So I would really appreciate it. And then I can look and see what interests you and what doesn't. Always feel free to leave a constructive comment. If they are constructive, then I'll take them on board. Maybe how to improve things you like, things that you think maybe need a bit of tweaking. I'm all ears. So thanks very much, and don't forget to subscribe.